Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's virtual Chancellor's Colloquium featuring author and journalist Gary Young and hosted by UC Davis Chancellor Gary S. May. Thank you for participating. I'm Don Roth, Executive Director of the Mondavi Center for the Performing Arts, which is proud to join the Chancellor's office in sponsoring this special event. Allow me to tell you a bit about how this event will flow. In a few moments, I will welcome Chancellor May to our virtual stage to introduce tonight's speaker. Following the talk, Chancellor May will sit down virtually with Gary Young, who is in London, to moderate a Q&A. If you want to ask Mr. Young a question, you can use Zoom's Q&A function to submit your question at any time during this event. And now it is my honor and pleasure to welcome the 7th Chancellor of UC Davis to begin tonight's colloquium, Dr. Gary S. May. Since his arrival in 2017, Chancellor May has been leading UC Davis to new heights in academic excellence, enterprise research, public service, and upward mobility of students of all backgrounds. In 2015, President Obama honored him with the Presidential Medal for Excellence in STEM Mentoring. In 2018, he was inducted to the National Academy of Engineering for his success in attracting and retaining engineering students from underrepresented backgrounds and for his innovations in semiconductor manufacturing. In April 2020, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences for his educational and academic leadership. Please welcome Chancellor Gary S. May.
Thank you, Don. On behalf of UC Davis and the Mondavi Center for the Performing Arts, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Chancellor's Colloquium. This distinguished speaker series was created to generate conversations with some of the most thoughtful and creative minds of our times. Our guest today is already a great friend of UC Davis. Gary Young joined us in March as the featured author in our campus community book project with a presentation on gun violence. I'm thrilled that he's joining us once again, this time for a discussion titled Going Viral: Race, Racism, and Rebellion in the Midst of a Pandemic. Gary Young is an award-winning author of 5 books, a broadcaster, and an academic based in London. After 26 years with the Guardian newspaper, he left earlier this year to serve as a professor of sociology at Manchester University. We asked Gary to join us because of his poignant insights into the human condition and the deep challenges faced by society. We're certainly living in historic times with many calls for deep systemic change. The COVID-19 pandemic has uprooted our world and exposed inequalities within our communities, especially with people of color. Meanwhile, the death of George Floyd and others have led to months of protest and exposed the deep racial divisions of American life. My hope is that today's conversation will help us better understand the forces that seek to divide us and the possible solutions for better days. As Gary once wrote in The Guardian, things look bleak. The propensity to despair is strong, but should not be indulged. Sing yourself up. Imagine a world in which you might thrive, for which there is no evidence, and then fight for it. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to a fascinating conversation. Gary, take it away.
Thank you, Chancellor May, for your generous introduction. And thank you, UC Davis, for having me back. It's a real honor, having been on campus in a very different time, very early March, to be back now speaking to you, albeit virtually and more than 5,000 miles away. But my heart is very much with you. My wife is American. My children are American. I covered America for 12 years as the US correspondent for The Guardian and as a columnist for The Nation. And during that time, the decades, like hurricanes, seem to have names. Not single names like Katrina or Maria, but full names like Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown. And like hurricanes, their arrival was both predictable and predicted, and yet somehow when they landed, the effect was still shocking. The precise alchemy that made one particular death totemic while others went unmourned beyond their families and communities was never quite clear to me. Video helps, but it's not essential. Footage of people running away or policemen rolling up like death squads and effectively executing people who pose no real threat barely pricked the popular imagination sometimes. And when the authorities fail to heed community outrage or substantially investigate, let alone discipline the police, the situation could become explosive. So we don't know exactly why this is the summer of George Floyd and why his killing captured the political imagination in a way that others will not. But we do know that his death had a global impact in a way that others have not. Spreading like a bushfire from big cities to small towns, from Iceland to Nairobi, and from Finland to Bogota, to rural hamlets in America, with huge demonstrations all over the world. But it wasn't the only thing that happened that day. 13 hours and 1,200 miles away, before Lloyd was killed, a black man was birdwatching in the Ramble, a semi-wild part of New York's Central Park, when a cocker spaniel bounded into view, pursued by a white woman loudly calling for him. Now, dogs aren't allowed off a leash in a Ramble, and the man asked the owner to observe the rules. When she refused, the black birdwatcher threw her dog some treats and started to video her. An altercation at distance ensued. "I'm going to tell the cops," she told him, "that there's an African-American man threatening my life." Once she got through to emergency services, she told the dispatcher, "There's a man, he's African-American, he's recording me and he's threatening me and my dog." Becoming increasingly shrill and panicky, she would go on to mention that he was African-American 2 more times. In his book, Ways of Seeing, John Berger wrote, "The way we see things is affected by what we know and what we believe. But the relation between what we see and what we know is never settled." The sight of Floyd being killed in real time is shocking, but news of it isn't. His death at the hands of police doesn't contradict what we think and know about relations between African Americans and the police, but confirms them. We know this because it has historical precedent. We know this because we've seen it happen again and again. We know this because this is not just how America works, it is, on some levels, how America was built. And like a hurricane, we know such deaths are coming. We just never know when or where or how much damage they will do. The interaction in Central Park, on the other hand, is in many ways more challenging. In America's racial morality play, the brutal white officer with a badge, using disproportionate and deadly force on an unarmed black man, is a familiar character. But the Upper West Side female dog walker wearing a mask and using the appropriate racial terminology fits less easily into the cartoonish and crude understanding of how American racism operates. And yet, there she is, marshalling her relative privilege, drawing on centuries of once spoken but now inherently understood tropes. A black man physically threatening a white woman in the woods, to summon the state to protect her right to walk her dog untethered in a Ramble that she actually doesn't have. Now, these two incidents occurred entirely independently. It was just another day in America. And yet, to understand the nature of American racism, it's important to understand them not separately, but together. The brutal and the banal, the lethal and the liberal, the violence that's inflicted and the violence that is implied. For they operate not separately, but in concert. The dog walker's threat makes no sense without the promise of policeman's violence. His violence wouldn't be possible without the tacit endorsement of those like her. Both knew they were being filmed. One must assume that they wouldn't have acted in that way if they could have foreseen the ramifications. And as such, each in their own way betrays the reflexes, impulses, and instincts of people who believe such behavior will elicit no detrimental consequences beyond bending the world and those they imagine to be the racial subordinates whom they encounter within it to their will. Both videos went viral, coursing through social media, attaching themselves to personal networks and makeshift political structures, building inchoate constituencies of indignation and outrage. Summer in America is the season of rebellion. It's when Watts, Newark, and Detroit erupted in violence in the 60s, sparked by callous policing. It's when school is out, pool parties are on, and domestic life, particularly in urban centres, is turned inside out, from the living room to the stoop, from the couch to the street. It's when tempers get short and resentments bubble up like molten asphalt. It's when, to paraphrase Langston Hughes, deferred dreams explode. But this was no ordinary summer, and these videos were not the only things that went viral. This was a summer when we were all told to cover our mouths, stay at home, and not see our friends. This was the summer when we all realized we were connected from Wuhan to Wisconsin. The summer when we realized that borders, walls, and visas are no match for the human need to roam in search of work, love, adventure, or flee from war, poverty, or environmental devastation. This was the summer when the currency of experts, science, and trust in government all held a premium. The summer when, for society to function, you had to care about people you don't know, because failing to do so was a matter of life and death. On one level, coronavirus clearly established our common humanity. That's what made it global. COVID made a nonsense of the divisions of nation, religion, region, race, or caste. Our bodies are all the same. Anybody could catch the virus, anybody could die from it. Variations in susceptibility for age or medical condition merely prove the point. There is no culture in which people do not get old or sick. But it rapidly became clear that while anybody could die from it, some people were more likely to die from it than others. Black Americans are almost 3 times, and Chicanos more than 3 times more likely than white people to contract the virus. A New York Times study revealed that in that 249 counties where African Americans made up more than 5,000 people, in 235 of them, the rate was higher for African Americans than for whites. Among Latinos in the same cohort, in 178 out of 206 counties, the rates were higher for Latinos than whites. In Fairfax County near Washington, D.C., 4 times as many Latino residents tested positive for the virus through to the end of May, even though there are 3 times as many white people living there as Latinos. If anything, these statistics actually understate the problem, because the old are disproportionately affected and Black and Latino populations are younger. Now, the question of why this should be is not really very difficult to fathom. The poorer people are, the more likely they are to have to work, to be unable to shield or socially distance, the less likely they are to have health insurance or even be healthy in the first place. 3 countries, the US, Brazil, and Mexico, account for nearly half of the world's reported COVID-19 deaths, yet they contain only 8.6% of the world's population. They also happen to have among the highest rates of income and wealth inequality in the Western world. If America had a robust welfare state or comprehensive socialized medicine provision, much of this would be mitigated, but it wouldn't be prevented entirely. Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom, where I come from, account for 60% of Europe's COVID deaths, even though they're home to just 38% of Europe's population. All 3 have welfare states and socialized medicine, but all 3 have higher than average rates of income and wealth inequality. What has this got to do with Black and brown people? Well, put bluntly, we tend to be poorer. Across America, 43% of Black and Latino workers are employed in service or production jobs that for the most part cannot be done remotely. Only about 1 in 4 white workers held such jobs. Also, Latino people are twice as likely to reside in a crowded dwelling, less than 500 square feet per person, as white people, according to the American Housing Survey. And these statistics are why attempts to analyze race and class as though they existed in discrete and distinct silos from each other fail always on every level. Trying to understand race and class each separately is to misunderstand them both completely. Discussing race as it relates to poverty is not an issue of identity politics. It's a matter, particularly with COVID, of life and death. In Britain, where I live, there are similar racial discrepancies. According to the Office for National Statistics here, adjusting for age, black people are more than 4 times more likely to die from COVID than white people. Pakistanis and Bangladeshis are more than 3 times as likely. Indians, more than twice as likely. Minorities account for 13.4% of the British population, but they make up 34% of the patients admitted to intensive care units for COVID, and for similar reasons. Analysis of the English Housing Survey, for example, found that between 2014 and 2017, Bangladeshi families were 15 times more likely to experience overcrowding than white British households. Pakistanis were 8 times more likely, black people were 6 times more likely. All 3 groups were more likely to live in deprived neighborhoods, experience higher unemployment, higher poverty, and lower incomes than white people. On either side of the Atlantic, this is what systemic discrimination looks like. Not isolated incidents, but a range of processes built on presumption, assumption, confidence, ignorance, and exclusionary institutional, personal, and professional networks, all buttressed by the dead weight of privilege. We are not dying disproportionately because we are black and brown. We are dying disproportionately because being black and brown has made us poor. Race is a construct. The social cultural anthropologist Roger Sanjak once wrote, "Marble cake, crazy quilt, and tutti frutti, they're all better metaphors for human physical variability than is the X number of races in humankind." But while race may be a construct, racism is very real. It's not the virus that discriminates, it's society. COVID is deadly for everybody, but inequality has laid out the conditions for it to kill black and brown people disproportionately. Being black or brown in America and in Britain is a pre-existing condition. These deaths are the collateral damage of racism, the indirect consequence of decades of exclusion that have corralled minorities into the kind of jobs, housing, and health situations that would make us particularly vulnerable. And yet, because our lives literally depend on it, we are forced to make this obvious fact explicit in the hope that some will cease to regard the obscene as inevitable. So what is the connection between the racial discrepancies of COVID-19 and the Summer of Rebellion in which those discrepancies took place? Well, the virus has demonstrated how racism can kill in far less dramatic ways and in far greater numbers without offering a morality play that might be shared on social media. Referring to the heightened state of awareness following the death of George Floyd, Stacey Abrams, the African-American one-time gubernatorial candidate for Georgia, said, "Part of the reason that these are systemic inequalities is that they just transcend not only party, but time. We have to be very intentional about saying that this is not about one moment or one murder, but the entire infrastructure of justice." Pretty much exactly the same thing could be said for COVID. Since we didn't get to this place by accident, we won't get out of it by chance. To witness the media and political classes respond to this moment and to discover the reality of racism is much like seeing teenagers discover sex. They do so urgently, earnestly, voraciously, and carelessly, with great self-indulgence, but precious little self-awareness. The knowledge that it's out there collides with the urgent desire to find out where. People talk about it endlessly and carelessly, unsure of what to say or think. They have lots of questions, but even if they did know whom to ask, they'd be too crippled by embarrassment to reveal their ignorance. Everyone has an opinion, but only a few have any experience. And the interest never goes away, though its intensity wanes as they explore other things. In a quote most often attributed to Mark Twain, he said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes." And as someone who reported from America for more than a decade, I feel like we have kind of been here before. It does remind me of covering the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina as a reporter for The Guardian. I'd been doing a feature at the time about police killings in Jamaica when it hit, and had not long before been in Haiti to cover the anniversary of the coup there. And so I made my way to the Crescent City from Kingston, Jamaica. And when I arrived, I saw US troops stationed outside the harassed casino, as mostly black people were plucked from trees and roofs, and bodies floated down main streets or started decomposing in houses. And it felt to me that it wasn't just the levees that had been breached, but the facade of a first world nation. One of the US's most celebrated cities appeared to me like Port-au-Prince in Haiti, only with skyscrapers. The hurricane, like COVID, had not created the inequalities of race and class so evident in the aftermath. It had simply laid them bare. When Katrina struck, more than 44% of New Orleans residents were functionally illiterate. Close to 1 in 3 African Americans in Louisiana lived in poverty. Rates of black infant mortality in the state were worse than infant mortality in Sri Lanka. A black male life expectancy was the same as that for men in Kyrgyzstan. African Americans were less likely to leave town before the storm came because they were less likely to have cars or cash. As thousands of people, most of them black, flocked to the convention center in search of shelter and sustenance, the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Michael Brown, said, "We're seeing people that we didn't know exist." Rarely has a truer word been said. But just because they discovered them doesn't mean that they weren't there all along. They may not have realized we existed, but we did. They may not have seen us, but we were there. When the police and politicians ordered protesters during the rebellions to go back to their communities, there seemed to be little recognition that that is where they were dying in such disproportionate numbers through COVID. If we listen and examine George Floyd's last words as a police officer knelt on his neck, and the tribulations of the ailing pandemic patient with a ventilator, we can see the connective tissue between the most brazen forms of state violence and the most banal manifestations of inequality. For in both cases, the appeal to get off our necks comes with the plaintive words, "I can't breathe." Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for that inspiring talk. The question and answer session with Gary Young, moderated by Chancellor May, will begin momentarily. Remember, you can still submit a question for Mr. Young by using Zoom's Q&A function. We have been receiving many questions, so we apologize in advance if we're not able to get to yours. And now, welcome back, Gary Young and Gary May.
Thank you, Don. Gary, such a pleasure to be with you again. I always enjoy your insightful commentary and reflections. Really is an honor to have you. I'm going to ask the first question myself. It wasn't so long ago that we were thinking about and grieving Ahmaud Arbery, and we didn't finish grieving until we had George Floyd, and then we didn't finish grieving Floyd till we had Breonna Taylor, and we haven't finished grieving any of them. And just a few days ago, Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back in Wisconsin. From your vantage point in London, I just have to ask, what do you think the perceptions are of the United States and how we're managing race relations?
It's a very good question, Chancellor May. And first of all, thanks so much for having me back. I'm very grateful. I think the first thing to understand from the vantage point of Britain and actually the rest of Europe is that racism is certainly not unique to America. And we saw that with the way that the Black Lives Matter issue pollinated all over Europe. Really, there were 3,000 people out in Reykjavik, Iceland. There was a big demonstration in Helsinki. There were huge demonstrations in Britain. And so from our vantage point, we see in America much of what we see here and elsewhere. What's different is the level of lethality, the level of that things escalate to the point of death so quickly. That in Britain the police aren't armed. In other European countries they are, but the police seem certainly less quick to move to that point. And it's a real. America has hard power. It has nuclear weapons. It has the biggest military in the world. It has a huge economy. It has all of those things. But actually, in many ways, more penetrating is its soft power. That this is a country that, generally speaking, people in the rest of Europe aspire to. That they kind of that they look at as a kind of being culturally in the forefront. And these deaths look brutal, and they really undermine America's pretension to speak for the rest of the world, to speak for the free world, and so on. And that's been a historical problem. That was true in the civil rights period, when one of Kennedy's advisors said, "Our friends are embarrassed and our enemies are delighted when they see these pictures." So what we see isn't entirely foreign, apart from the lethal nature of it.
Well, starting the audience questions, you once said in an interview, the further you are from power, the more you see. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yes, I mean I can speak actually first of all literally. So in 2001, I think, or 2005, I can't remember. 2001, I think. I followed Tony Blair. I was on his bus. It would be the equivalent to being on a president's plane. I was on his bus, following him around during the election campaign. And as a result, I actually, we were ushered from place to place. So we didn't really see anything. You really didn't see anything apart from him talking to the audience, and you could see that on television. So there could be, and sometimes there were, demonstrations outside, or real people with real concerns, and you never got to see any of them. More metaphorically and generally, it's my feeling that political change happens kind of in neighborhoods, in towns, in hamlets, in people's homes. A light goes on, a switch turns, people kind of shift their thinking. And that it's not that, for example, covering the White House or being on a president's plane doesn't have some value, but I've generally found, for example, the last election, I stayed in Muncie, Indiana for the entire election period, and I feel convinced I found out more than if I'd been on anybody's plane about the issues that were affecting the country. That the closer you get to power, the more things are choreographed, almost for a journalist, for the benefit of a journalist, and the time to think, and the less space there is for a kind of the human evolution, where you find people who voted for Obama and now vote for Trump, or who had a certain view about socialized medicine and then they got sick, or whatever it is. People's lives are far richer than the politics that that they produce.
You said during your presentation very powerfully that race is a construct. Racism is real, however. Can you imagine a world where race is irrelevant or inoperative? Is that even possible?
When you introduced me, you quoted from me saying we have to imagine a world that doesn't exist, and then we have to fight for it. And that's what I feel like when I see or imagine a world without race. I can't see it, but I have to try and imagine it, and I have to try and fight for it. It was only less than a month, a few weeks after King gave his dream speech that a Klansman bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. King couldn't see it, but we're still working on the basis of that utopian vision that he set forward.
So one of our audience members wants to know then, what does the U.S. need to do beyond reforming police, which is sort of goes without saying, to conquer racism and imagine this world, if it is possible? What are some of the steps you would recommend?
I mean, that's a big question. I mean, one of the things that I believe is that some kind of, just after the war, the U.S. led a Marshall Plan for Europe to rebuild Europe. It was devastated. And they saw it as in its own interest to build other economies in other countries thousands of miles away. Mm-hmm. I think that urban America, inner city America, needs a Marshall Plan. It needs to make a massive priority to understand that this is for everybody's benefit. And I think that's possible. I think America is the richest country in the world. I am constantly, when I'm asked about the prospects for gun reform, I say, if you can elect Obama twice and then you can elect Donald Trump, you can do anything. And so that would be where I would start, a massive economic and social investment in the country's inner cities.
I strongly agree with that approach. Vanessa asks, well, first she says, thank you for your profound presentation. Then she wants to know, what do you think should be the role of the public university within the U.S. context to mediate racial inequity and injustice? And I'll just say that whatever you answer, they're going to ask me to do here, so be easy.
Do whatever he says. I think that the role of a public university is kind of like it's an incubator. It's a chance to bring people from a range of backgrounds and potentials, and to have them a kind of certain kind of alchemy where they're all brought together. I was speaking to the Chancellor of Oxford University, who has a program to bring in people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and they have a year to kind of catch up because their schools aren't as good as the private schools that many of the kids they go to. And he spoke about the effect of COVID. He said, when they were here, we had them all, and we could create a community. We could create the conditions for their success. Now they're back home. Some of them can't do the Zoom calls because they're sharing a room with 3 other people and they're not allowed out, or it's too noisy where they live, or whatever. And he said, and so we're trying to find different ways to lose them. So we are trying to find different ways to bring them back. So the public university is that opportunity with public space and learning to kind of to make that mix work, and as I benefited from, and many others, to allow for a degree of social mobility. That can happen at university, that you go in as the product of one system and you can come out as a product of another system. That's
very true, very true. Our Professor Emeritus of Applied Science, Yin Yi, asks, given the current extremely volatile situation in the USA with the combination of COVID-19, the pandemic still out of control, African Americans and other people of color being marginalized by the police, and the existence of extreme weather in the form of drought, fire, hurricanes. What is your suggestion on the first immediate action to take among people in the USA to start to correct these problems? That's a huge question.
That is a huge question. I mean, the one thing that I would say is that none of what we're talking about makes any sense if we don't have a planet on which to do it.
That's right.
So, urgency of climate change, which I believe is real, of that, because without that, we can't do anything else.
Yeah, I agree. So our first priority needs to be to address the planet we live on, because that's the foundation for the rest of it, right? So speaking of the pandemic, I asked you how the U.S. is being viewed in terms of race relations. I want to ask you about the pandemic as well. How do you think, from London or from anywhere else around the world, what are the perceptions of the American response to COVID-19? Are you still there? We may have lost Gary. We'll try to get him back. If we can't, we will perhaps record our conversation and play it back for you in the future if we can't get the technical difficulty solved. Okay, I'm being told that we're not going to be able to get him back, unfortunately, which is a loss for us. It was a fascinating talk for sure. And we did get to ask a few questions for which you provided very, very powerful, insightful answers. And I'm very happy that he was able to join us. It's very late there in London as well. So thank you for joining us as well, audience. Again, I just want to thank Gary Young for being here today and for speaking on a topic that's so relevant to the current moment in our society and to our campus community. I also want to thank everyone for attending. We have a number of future colloquia in the planning stages, and I look forward to seeing you at those events virtually as well. I wish everyone good health and safety, and thanks again. Thanks for coming back. Remind our audience that we had some technical difficulties last time. We wanted to get a chance to continue this conversation. So there were several questions that were in the queue when we were disconnected. So I'm going to just resume with some of our audience questions, and we'll talk for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then sign off.
Okay.
So what role do you think higher education plays in transforming society in matters of social and racial justice?
I think higher education can be like the crucible for some kind of meritocracy. That if you can get the grades, if you can overcome the difficulties of being poor or going to a terrible school sufficiently to get into higher education, then at that point, there is the chance for you, first of all, to mix with people of all different backgrounds, and that is true for the rich as well as the poor. Mm-hmm. But secondly, to use your smarts to excel as much as is possible. Now, that's not going to work for everybody. There still will be discrimination. Professors get stopped and searched.
Indeed.
It's no guarantee that you won't face racism, but it leaves you equipped to engage. And without that, without the possibility of people knowing that they can get on, then what do they have to lose? Mm-hmm. Think of the quote, which I will mangle somewhat, but from James Baldwin, he said, "There's nothing so dangerous as a man who has nothing to lose. You do not need 10 men, only one will do. And higher education is a place where you can get a foothold.
Yeah, that assumes that the onus is on us in higher education to preserve some equity in our own institutions as well, though, right?
I think so, yeah. And to look not just for where people are, but where they could be, to look for their potential,
right.
as well as where they have arrived. That
Right.
I know people say, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but some people were born with loafers, and some people
right.
were born without laces at all. And that doesn't mean that they couldn't make it.
No boots. Yeah. um, an anonymous audience member asks, where do you think America's conversations and understanding about racism falls short, which allows racism to perpetuate here?
I think that there is, actually, I think this is true for conversations about race and racism in most places, not just America.
Mm-hmm.
There is a squeamishness, first of all, about the past, a desire not to talk, you know, why bring up old stuff? I don't want to talk about what has happened, but just what will happen. And you can't understand where we are unless you understand how we got here. And so that squeamishness, that kind of people feeling uncomfortable about things that have happened, that is a major obstacle. And then I think there is a kind of a desire, which is particularly American, to kind of wrap everything in the flag as quickly as you can, and to claim this exceptionalism where racism is understood as an aberration, as opposed to actually a kind of, that it's very difficult to understand America without it. Yeah. And people take that personally.
They do.
People take the conversation personally as opposed to structurally. That if one is to say that there is racism in America, that doesn't mean that all Americans, or even most Americans, are racist. Mm-hmm. It means they live in a country, that they were born into a country where this sickness pervades. That doesn't make them personally the people who are bad or wrong, but it means that if they take it personally, then immediately they say, but what, I haven't done anything. I didn't do anything. Mm-hmm. And actually, first of all, you don't have to do anything. But secondly, if you haven't, maybe you should do something. You know, I'm fond of saying in Britain that people will say, we won the war, even if they didn't vote, even if they didn't fight. Uh-huh. And they will say, we won the World Cup in 1966, the only time we won the World Cup, even if they didn't play. But when it comes to slavery or colonialism, everybody says, well, I didn't do that. And, well, you didn't play in 1966 either. You didn't fight in the war either.
Right.
And power has many parents, but the brutality that it takes to acquire it is nearly always an orphan.
Very interesting, very profound. And it really is hard for people to separate themselves from the structure in which they live and persist, right? So, and it's uncomfortable, and we have to have these uncomfortable conversations.
And I understand that. I understand why it's uncomfortable, but what we're seeing now is so much more uncomfortable than the conversation that we need to have.
It definitely is. Nick asks, how does the U.S. border fit into the picture of state violence and entrenched inequality, and how can we make migrant lives matter?
Well, that's a very good question, because there is always the danger that when we talk about Black Lives Matter and when we talk about racism, that we talk about it at the exclusion of other forms of discrimination and oppression, including poverty and all the things that kind of a lot of white people are going through, for example. But in this case, specifically with the Nick's question at hand, that once again, first of all, this is not unique to America. We, at the moment, have people dying in the English Channel. Just 2 weeks ago, a young, I think Sudanese boy was washed up on the English Channel. We have people dying in the Mediterranean. And so, to me, this is a question of how we export the humanity that we learned from Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter as a concept is about understanding, spreading our notion of who counts and why they count.
Yeah.
And that it's not a huge step, although for some it is, to then export that, which is not to say that everybody can come in or everybody can do this or everybody can do that. But if you start from the basis of humanity, then there's a series of things that shouldn't happen. Putting people in cages would be a good example.
Exactly.
If you start from the basis that some people are human and some people aren't, that all sorts of terrible things can happen. And that I think the connection between the moment we're experiencing inside America and what happens at the border is one of translating that desire for a kind of what I would call a militant humanism and taking it and applying it elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. Pat says in your book, you said in America, you look local and sound foreign. Does that help or hinder you as a journalist?
That's a very good question. So, there's quite a funny story which illustrates some of the problems, which is when I was in Mississippi, this is quite some time ago, and I called a school. There was a school where everything in the school was segregated. There was a black principal and a white principal, black homecoming queen, white homecoming queen. Everything within the school was segregated. And there was a history to that I won't go into now. But I called and spoke to the black principal. He said he didn't want to talk to me. And then I called and I spoke to the white principal, and it turned out that he had been on an exchange program near my hometown in England. And we chatted on the phone. He said, come over, we must talk. And when I come over, you could see his jaw drop because he was expecting a white guy.
Yeah.
And then he introduced me to the black principal, and I said, well, I called him, he didn't seem that keen. And when I spoke to the black principal, he kind of took me aside afterwards and he said, I'm so sorry, I thought you were white, and I'm so sick of talking to white people about this. And so there is a constant issue of mistaken identity. And you can see from that example, sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't. Quite often it just throws people. So in my book, the case was going to a funeral parlor to try and find a number for the family of the boy who'd been killed. So that's a peculiar request already. And then it comes wrapped in this black man with an English accent, and the woman just didn't know what to do with me. And so quite often it throws people. Yeah. Now, when people are thrown, they either give up the store, which is wonderful as a journalist, or they retreat and they get very suspicious. I have had a few times, and this grew as time went on, people saying to me, where are you really from? Come on. I mean, you're England, and I say, well, I live in Chicago. So you're from Chicago. Well, no, I'm from England.
That's funny. A related question. Tom asks, how well do you think the U.S. has done in overcoming social and racial divisions compared to other former British colonies?
Well, compared to other former British colonies, I feel, I've always felt that America, it's like Dickensian times. It's the best of times and the worst of times. That nowhere else where Black people are a minority have I seen as sizable a middle class, Black middle class.
Yeah.
Nowhere where Black people are a minority? Have I seen the number of Black police officers or judges? Or I'm not saying that it's enough or that it's proportionate. My point is, it's much worse elsewhere, on the one hand. On the other hand, I've never seen levels of incarceration, levels of levels of inequality. I've seen levels of poverty. Zimbabwe is a former British colony. Tanzania, Sierra Leone. I've been to places where there's been poverty, but not alongside the wealth. And one way of understanding that, I guess, and this goes just slightly beyond the question, but to the question that a lot of African Americans in particular ask, which is, where would you rather be? And I generally say, look, I'm glad that I was born in Britain. I'm glad I was born in Britain because I was one of 3 children, single parent. We were on free school meals. And in America, just statistically, one of us would have probably ended up dead or in prison. If you're poor and single parent family, statistically, you're not going to do very well in Britain. In Britain, when I was 8, I got a hernia. I went to hospital. It was cured. We didn't have to sell the store. My mother was an epileptic. Okay. She got the medication she needed. She didn't have to sell the store. When I got my grades, I could go to university. All you needed were your grades. There were, at the time, full grants. Mm-hmm. So I left without any debt. I studied in France and Russia. They paid for me to do that. When my mother died, they gave me a bit more money to keep me in education. But you get to that point in Britain, and then Britain doesn't really know what to do with you. And at that point, America does a much better job. If you got there already, and that was because of class in Britain, not really because of race. But then when you get to that point, then America can find, it's not unproblematic, but can find a place for you within the kind of higher echelons and hierarchies. So I don't think it's any accident, for example, that my brother, my eldest brother, ran the Travel Channel for 5 years. I don't think he would have got that opportunity in Britain, although he was well regarded as a TV executive.
Right.
If you look at actors like Idris Elba, or academics like Paul Gilroy, who go to America, or Carol Phillips, they come to America and they can thrive. So Britain can get you to a certain point, and then it doesn't know what to do with you. America, at that point, can take you further.
Yeah. Jessica asks, thank you, Gary, first for writing Another Day in the Death of America. Your ability to connect to and write for the families that you interviewed is exquisite. Is there a family from that book that has stayed with you the most, that you have become, as you have become a bona fide leader in the conversation on race and guns? Is there one of those families that has stuck with you?
It would have to be, they've all stuck with me in a way. I used to call them, as I was writing, I would call them my kids. You know, I would say, one of my kids lives there.
Wow.
Of course, I know they weren't my kids, but I studied them, and each one in their way was special. The first child to die in the book, Jaden, I have stayed in touch with his mother off and on when I was reporting on the 2016 election in Muncie. I drove a few hours to see her in Columbus. We email from time to time. Jaden's mother, he was 9. He answered the door and was shot in the head by her ex-partner. She has really been through it. And it's not that I've been through it with her, but she has we've remained reasonably close.
Okay. From Page, the civil rights era was characterized by strong political leadership and people like MLK and Malcolm X and other charismatic figures. Today's Black Lives Matter movement appears much more decentralized in nature, eschewing the model of formal leaders and representatives of the movement. First of all, do you agree with that? And is this model sustainable? Will it be effective in the long term?
It's a good question. I think that I do agree with that. I feel that there is this kind of, it's almost like a floating signifier, Black Lives Matter. I say to people in Britain, it's not like if you go to Chicago, there's a Black Lives Matter office. Right. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
And there are strengths to that in that it's very fast break. It's kind of caffeinated online. It can spread really quickly because it doesn't have to meet. There's no meeting. It doesn't have to plan. It can just it can explode. The trouble with that is that, first of all, it's at the mercy of events. So the kind of strategic capacity is diminished. You know, King finishes in Albany where things don't go so well, and they stop and they think, well, what do we do now? Where do we go now? And then they decide on Birmingham, and they decide that children should lead, and he decides that he will go to jail. And there's a problem with that insofar as it's a handful of people, and a charismatic leader isn't always the best thing, but at least there is a plan about what to do. And so I feel like what this moment has done is proved its capacity to clear space, to create space, to kind of galvanize a big multiracial, multi-generational constituency. But what it lacks is the ability to build on that space. So we see these things flare up, go down, flare up and go down.
It's somewhat reactive instead of strategic, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great points. Asma asks, and Asma, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Is it possible to dismantle racism without dismantling capitalism? And do you see any signs there might be genuine seeds of interest in alternatives to capitalism in the US and in the UK?
Well, there's definitely interest in something else. That's clear if you look at the number of young people who say they are interested or in favor of socialism. I think it's a majority of under 35s. My sense of what they mean by socialism is actually kind of social democracy, really. Yeah. It's what they mean isn't Soviet Union or Cuba, it's healthcare, universal healthcare, maybe free college tuition, that kind of thing, higher taxes for the better paid. It's certainly possible to have capitalism without racism, where because in all black and virtually all white countries, you can still have capitalism.
Yeah, or all Asian, such as Japan.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But because capitalism is a system that we are in, it informs the nature of the racism that we see. The question of what that would look like in a social society is very difficult to tell because we've never really seen one. But I do get a sense, particularly generationally, here, if you look at young people and how they responded to Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, which was quite different from their parents and their grandparents. And in America, if you look at young people and how they responded to Bernie Sanders and what they tell pollsters, then there was a clear interest in another system. But if you look at the voter turnout, if you look at the participation in kind of mainstream politics, then there's the will, but not the motivation yet, not on the scale that would be necessary.
Yeah, it's interesting how our young people fuse those two things, capitalism and racism. I don't think they should assume that you don't have racists in non-capitalist countries, because you do, in fact, right? So,
Yeah.
Well, that was actually the last question we have recorded here, Gary. I want to thank you for just being so generous with your time, despite the technical difficulties we had, and want to wish you the best with your book and any upcoming projects that you have, and hope that you're not going to be a stranger to UC Davis. Hope we get a chance to interact again in the future.
I really hope so too. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and it's a real pleasure, albeit virtually, to be back with you. So thanks very much.